Welcome, 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 everybody. Thank you for being with us. On the phone with us today is Reuven S. Avi-Yonah. I hope I'm saying that right. Uh, he is a professor of law and the director of the International Tax LLM program at Michigan Law. He's the Irwin I. Cohn Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. Recently, he wrote this article about political polarization in the American Prospect called Overcoming Political Polarization, Federal Funding of Education is Key. And he wrote that in 2020 in the American Prospect. Mostly what he said was, if the captions were removed, the picture looks remarkably like the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. Blue states voted for Biden. They're red for Trump. The exceptions are Kansas and Utah. Blue states voting for Trump, and Wisconsin and Nevada, red states voting for Biden. But one cannot mistake the correlation in the other 46 states. Even Georgia, the big surprise of 2020, is correctly colored. You were talking about how people with low education seem to also be, or states with low education rankings seem to be the places that also voted for Trump. There's one more quote I'd like to read, if I may. In order to make this happen, we need presidential leadership. We need a president who will address inequality of opportunity as a major problem and persuade his or her fellow Americans that addressing it is a major national challenge and that we should be willing to tax ourselves at 5% on sales of goods, services, as well as imports to finance a national attempt to provide the necessary preconditions for the pursuit of happiness of every American child. Did I get your introduction correct, Professor? Okay. Why did you write this article, Overcoming Political Polarization, 3 years ago? What was going on 3 years ago? What did you see? What compelled you to think, it's the year 2020, I need to write an article on political polarization? Obviously, you took a link between education levels and how they voted for Trump, but why write this article in 2020? What were you seeing? Why did you think this was an important article to write at that time?
So I wrote it in 2020 because that was the election year. But my, engagement with this issue dates back to the 2016 election year, where I was actually at the time living in a very, quote, red area of Michigan.
Okay.
And what I felt during the election season was that I was getting increasingly alienated from all of my neighbors, all of whom were Trump voters, and I, am a Democrat. And I felt very uncomfortable about that, and I didn't think that that's the way things should be. I think we should be able to talk to each other, but it felt increasingly uncomfortable that time. And then because of that, in 2018, when I had a sabbatical, my wife and I did a huge road trip over 6 months in various states and counties that had voted for Trump. That is, we started in Michigan, but we went to Oklahoma and Texas and Tennessee and the Carolinas and Mississippi and all over the place, and tried to talk with people. And my wife's a psychologist, who's very good at it, so we talked to a lot of people, and we got about 35 hours of recorded interviews out of that. And so I came to the conclusion that it's possible to overcome political polarization in this country, and also that this is a really, really important thing, because are we really doomed every 4 years to kind of fight with each other literally, like it seems to be happening. So this article is part of a set of articles which explore various ways in which this gap can be bridged. I think education is very important, but I also think economic opportunity for adults is very important. And I wrote another article about how we can try to get more investment into the so-called heartland, that is the less developed areas of the non-coastal areas, the flyover states, including Michigan, and so on. And I always, a lot of my proposals have to do with the idea that my specialty is tax law, as you can imagine, that the federal tax system can play a useful role in bridging these kind of gaps. So this particular article was inspired, in fact, by something that happened even earlier when my daughter was in high school, and she went to a private school in the suburbs of Detroit, and they did an exchange day with Cass Tech, which is probably the best public high school, and verified the conditions there in terms of access to computers, not enough space in the lunchroom and various other things. And she asked me, why was that? And I said, well, do you know how education is financed in this country? And she said, no, of course not. And I said, well,
yeah.
Finance. In her case, it was financed by her parents, right? Because
exactly. I know how things are financed. Daddy and mommy pay for it, right? No, well, yeah, but there's a little bit more to it. Yeah.
Right. So
Kids.
I explained to her the property tax system and how, even though there was an equalization attempt, it's not really equal and so on. And so then we did this whole article together that also got published, essentially exploring. So this was kind of the statistical background to this American Prospect article. The idea was to explore ways in which you can equalize spending. And the fundamental problem in Michigan was that it's inconceivable, because the state is so polarized along racial lines, it's almost inconceivable that the states will vote to essentially equalize educational opportunity in the city of Detroit specifically. And in addition, the amounts that are needed in order to essentially, the question was, what does it take to spend in the city of Detroit per pupil the same amount that is spent in, let's say, Bloomfield Hills or, one of the rich Detroit suburbs? And the answer was X amount, and it's something that's unaffordable for the state of Michigan. And that's where I came up with this idea, which is kind of my standard idea, namely that most of these problems, as far as pure finance are concerned, could be solved if we had what every other rich country has, which is a value-added tax or a goods and services tax,
right,
at the federal level.
I apologize for interrupting, but I want to make sure I understand, and the audience gets to correct me if I'm getting this wrong, Professor. Did you say that you don't think the plan you proposed would work in Michigan because it's too racially polarized, or did I mishear that?
The problem is that there's a long history of animosity between the suburbs of Detroit and Detroit.
Okay.
And that's very well documented. It's probably the most segregated, or one of the most segregated areas in the country. If you drive from Detroit along the river, and the moment you cross into Grosse Pointe, you can see the contrast where Detroit's that area in particular is very poor, and Grosse Pointe is very rich, and it's along racial lines, basically. It used to be completely along racial lines, and a little bit less. And so that's why attempts to create a unified school district, for example, that includes both the suburbs and Detroit, failed. In the attempts of equalizing funding also failed, and the legislature at Lansing, the Michigan State Legislature, has consistently blocked attempts to use Michigan-wide taxes to fund, to raise the level of education in Detroit, which is, the public schools, they are, most of them are among the worst. And even the good ones, like Tech, have an awful learning conditions. So much so that some federal judge said that this is a constitutional violation, although that, of course,
Yep. I remember there was the UN special rapporteur came and did a tour of America when Obama was president. You almost never saw this in the media because they didn't want to cover it. And he basically said parts of America are third world. They're just straight up. Don't even act like you're a first world country. You are in parts, and then other parts you're third world. And this was at the end of Obama's second term. So it really kind of negated his message of, hope and change. So they really covered very well. But I remember seeing that and going, wow, somebody who knows came here and said, sorry, parts of America are straight up like as developed as Central Africa. Don't get it twisted. You guys are not better. And this problem has existed for decades. and it didn't even get fixed under the most competent president we've seen in decades.
Exactly.
Sounds kind of bad. Let me ask you though, you personally experienced alienation over politics in 2016 and it shocked you. It's now 2023, 7 years later. Political polarization is better or worse now than in 2016?
Probably worse, I'm shocked to say. At least in this, you know, I'm sad to have to say this, but my sense is that post January 6, 2021, the perceptions of the Republicans and Democrats have drifted even further apart, and the news that they watch and the bubble effect has become even worse, so that it was impossible. And so what we asked people during our road trip in 2018 was, what do you think is the American dream? And is there still something shared? And when you talk to people at that level, there was a lot in common. But, now when you talk politics, at least with them, I find it very difficult to talk politics with anybody who votes for Trump, even though I've tried recently to reconnect with some of the people that we met back then who are, moderates as I think of them, but the moment you raise January 6th with them, they respond with Hunter Biden, and I just don't feel that there's something to talk about.
So I think what you're saying, correct me again if I'm wrong, Professor, you experienced a level of polarization in 2016 you never expected. This is wow, this is shocking, this is bad, this shouldn't, I'm surprised at how bad it is. Then you traveled to other American states in 2017, 2018, and you met Trump voters. And you had conversations, and you found that you could find some commonality with these Trump voters in 2018. But now when you reach out to those same Trump voters that you talked to in 2018, they seem even more polarized, and you have an even harder attempt to have a conversation that you were able to have years before. Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right.
Conversations become even harder. You used to be able to talk to these Trump supporters 5 years ago, and now you can't even do that. What chance does that have that we're naturally going to come together on our own as Americans?
I wish I knew what could fix this. I mean, as I said, I think education is one thing. I think part of the problem is that there is no common set of values that is inculcated in the public school. I mean, the whole idea of having public schools, and the United States was the pioneer in having public schools for everybody, was that there would be a shared base of knowledge that every citizen, however much education they get after grade school, will have, that their understanding of civics and American history and so on will be common. And now even that has broken down, both in terms of different textbooks are written for California and for Texas and that sort of stuff.
Right.
But on a fundamental level, I think it's the resource inequality that I've people that I talked with during that trip showed such a profound, I would have to say, and these are people that were high school graduates, lack of knowledge of even the most basic facts of American history that I was genuinely.
Yeah. I've said that. I've said to a lot of people, if we just had every single American high school student have to pass the immigration test, we'd have no civic problems in America, because immigrants, I'm in California, we have tons of immigrants. Immigrants typically know more about how the government works, how America works, than your average high schooler. That's just what I've seen. To give the same test we give to immigrants. You don't get to come into this country if you know this stuff. You don't get to graduate high school if you don't know this stuff. I see a lot of ignorance. We cut civics, we cut government. I remember being a kid in the 1990s, and they were cutting these things that had been part of high schools for generations. Civics, debate, government. 30 years ago, they cut that. Now we have one of the most ignorant populaces of how the government works ever. Maybe there's a connection between we cut these school subjects in high school, and then we get stupid adults who don't know how it works later.
Exactly.
What what so obviously you heard about Marjorie Taylor Greene and her call for national divorce on President's Day. You wrote this article in 2020. She made that call 3 years later, recently. What is your opinion of Marjorie Taylor Greene and her call for national divorce? In your words, Professor.
Well, I don't want to rush my opinion on Marjorie Taylor Greene in every recorded interview.
Okay, a lot of people say I'm not a big fan of hers. I'm not a big supporter of hers. That's fine. She says some racist stuff, Jewish space lasers, the gazpacho police, a lot of craziness. But fair enough. But was she wrong when she said it seems like the blue and the red in this country can't get along anymore?
So, look, I don't think she was wrong about that. I think the idea of a national divorce is simply not, I think, not just not realistic, literally not possible, because it's kind of, so if you, like in the map that you mentioned, it's all very nice if you talk about blue states and red states, and you can talk, then you can talk about, you can actually draw a map. And I remember the first time I saw this kind of map was after the Bush election in 2000.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yes, absolutely. The blue and red map of America appeared in the 2000 election. Most people forget that.
And the blue states are contiguous with Canada, all of them. So they could secede and join Canada, that was the proposal. Except that this forgets something very basic, which is that, and this is also something we encountered in the trip, and also more recently, every red state has a lot of blue cities in it, for example. It's basically impossible to draw a line in the United States that you'd have to, in most cases, have cities disconnected from their immediate rural area around them. And I just don't see how a national divorce like that can happen. I think the reality is that we need to find ways to work together if we want to survive as a country and have any kind of decent hope for our children life here. And so this problem is an imperative, and there is no easy solution like a national divorce. At least that's my view.
So the problem's real. Maybe she's a horrible spokesperson. There's a problem real, but it sounded a few minutes ago you weren't totally sure what solutions would definitively fix this problem.
I don't have a silver bullet, and I don't know what solution would definitively fix this problem. I mean, I think there's so many issues to be addressed, and as I said, the only thing I regard myself as an expert on is money, right? How to fund things.
Right.
I can tell you exactly what rate of tax will fund whatever number you throw at me as the necessary number in order to do something. I do not know anything about all of this other stuff. I'm not a political scientist, and certainly not a politician. I don't, there's a limit to what I can tell you. I'm just speaking as a concerned citizen that this whole thing worries me, but I don't have solutions.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it. And that's why we're trying to talk to as many possible people as we can on the left and the right, columnists, reporters, philosophers, professors of economics, political science, sociology, international relations, just to try to get an informed conversation to the public. Let me ask you some tax questions if I can. So when they talked about national divorce, and Marjorie was like, oh, we're going to take our red states and break off from America, the response was by both people on Fox News and, MSNBC, you guys can't do that for this reason. Even if you broke off from the USA, you're recipient states. You receive more in federal tax money than you give every single year. You're going to lose like 50, 60% of your budget, or 30% the moment you break off, and you'll become instantly poor. And I thought, okay, there's some truth there. But if they were independent, wouldn't they have the ability to reduce tax rates and regulation rates And haven't we seen on the international scene that when countries can reduce taxes and regulations, that it typically, not always, encourages investment and helps grow that economy? Is it fair to say you red states break off, you're going to be cut off from federal money, end of story, and have absolutely no discussion about how they could change their federal income tax rate or their international corporate tax rate?
Well, this is something that I've been writing on for years, and I don't think there are too many examples of countries, bringing in investment just by cutting taxes or even cutting taxes and systematic regulations. It takes significantly more than that, and usually it actually takes more investment in things like education, infrastructure, the rule of law, and various other things. I mean, there have been examples, of course, of countries who were able to bring in a lot of investments with low tax regimes, but the most successful ones typically have had all of these other advantages for one reason or another, which is what I negative. The prime example of a successful example like that is Ireland.
Thank you.
Which has been a case and really was able to reinvent itself by cutting the corporate tax rates, to 12.5%, which is among the lower ones, and being able to attract a lot of multinationals. But they started off with an English-speaking, very well-educated workforce, and with being a member of the EU, both advantages. So, for example, post-Brexit, the UK is a basket case, and it doesn't matter how much they cut taxes, it doesn't matter how much they cut regulations. This whole idea that they can somehow, by breaking out of the EU, cast off the regulatory yoke and be free to do their own tax policy and so on, has, in my judgment, led them nowhere. And that's generally been true with every single other country that has tried that recipe over the years. That's not the key to economic success unless it goes, that by itself is not the key to economic success. So that's why I'm doubtful that would work. I'm not saying, look, first of all, money isn't everything. And so it is certainly possible to imagine a situation where red states, if they broke off, have many built-in advantages that are not about low taxes or low regulations necessarily. They're more about things like, for example, geographic locations. There's a reason that a lot of people want to migrate to the Sun Belt, and it's not about taxes and regulations primarily. It's about the fact that living conditions there are nicer than in the Northeast or the Midwest in the winter. And that's just one thing that they have going for them. So, I think that I don't think that it is true to say that a national divorce is impossible for this kind of economic reasons, especially since, in our system, there's a limit to what is provided by the federal government. It is true that, there are inner states and paper states or whatever, but it is also true that a lot of the things that make for, like education, for example, it's, contrary to what I propose, is definitely not funded by the federal government. In fact, it's very much funded at the local level. And most of the other things that make your life, that make a difference in the quality of your life are funded either by the state or the locality. And so they don't necessarily need the federal money for that. So I don't think that's the issue. I'm doubtful that they would get there by cutting taxes or regulations, because frankly, they've already done that. I mean, a lot of red states, for example, have no corporate income tax at all. And plenty of them have, very, very lax regulatory regimes. And the growth rate that they experience is typically higher, but I am not sure that that's the only main reasons. But in addition, I don't think that this I mean, I'm not sure that they can go any lower if they were divorced. I mean, it's not as if the federal government, in fact, we have a very lax federalism system in the sense that the Supreme Court and the Fed, the Congress, basically never interferes with the internal tax regimes of states or with the regulatory regime either. I mean, there's a federal regulation that applies to everywhere.
That's what I'm talking about. That's the question. Yeah, I'd like to ask you about. So, if I may ask, if I'm sorry.
But what I don't know, again, this is not strictly a tax topic. I don't know how well how good the correlation there is between higher or lower federal regulations and higher or lower economic growth, and how can you test this given that the federal regulations apply? You know,
Sure.
You don't put test case of a part of the United States where federal regulations don't apply.
Let me ask you a few clarifying questions just so I can understand. Ireland did well because they were in a trade union with the EU, they were educated, and they were English speaking, and they had low taxes, the 12.5%, basically the lowest in the world. And that collectively helped it. We could at least say that the low tax corporate rate was a big part of their economic boom. I would also double down on that because the European Union is making Ireland raise their tax rate because they feel it's economically unfair to the rest of them. We could say that there is something to having a low corporate income tax rate that you cannot get as long as you're part of the federal level. Like you said, the federal regulations apply to all states. So if you were actually independent, you could theoretically make your rate as low as Ireland's. Obviously, it's not the full picture, but is there something to that? Ireland used low corporate income tax rates to help grow their economy in addition to other factors, and that the rest of the EU views that as an unfair advantage to the Ireland, and that's why they're all trying to raise an EU-wide corporate tax rate to remove that benefit for Ireland. Is that a fair summary?
I mean, I think it's certainly fair to say that there is now not just the EU-wide, but the global tax, corporate minimum tax deal at 15%, which will require Ireland to raise it by 2.5%. Yes. And that is driven not just by Ireland, but all of these other locations that have even lower. I mean, 12.5 is low by EU standards, but it's obviously there are lots of places with zero tax. But my point is that this would not, neither the original lowering, fundamentally the lowering of the Irish corporate tax to 12.5% would not have attracted any investor to Ireland, I believe, if they did not have these other conditions that are less under the immediate control of the government, namely, as I said, a well-educated workforce and access to the biggest market in the world.
And English speaking.
And English speaking. Yeah. I mean, all of this really attracted, especially the American multinational to set up shop in Ireland. And one smart thing that the Irish did is that they said, you can't just shift your profits here. You have to actually hire Irish people and, get them to work. And so all of these Apple and Microsoft and so on, they actually employ thousands of people each in Ireland, which I think was a very smart thing to do because there are advantages of working with this kind of large corporations. So it's a complicated question, and then this is something that people definitely can disagree with. I mean, I think one interesting question is: do actual tax havens with a zero income tax succeed? And you can debate the extent to which that is true. Sometimes, I actually think the best American example of this, but this is something that we took away, and this is, I think, an argument in favor of what you're saying, is Puerto Rico.
Thank you. I was going to ask you about Puerto Rico and how they have no federal income tax.
In '96, they didn't have to pay. There was no corporate tax basically for American multinationals investing in Puerto Rico at all. And then we took it away from them over this 10-year period between 1996 and 2006. And in my judgment and the judgment of a lot of economists, there's been a basket case ever since. This was it. And I wrote a whole article about how these kind of regional development incentives that are based on the tax system can actually and do actually work in attracting investment. And it was the same in, and even though the federal corporate tax does apply, nationwide, local tax benefits have been successful in attracting investment into various places that did not have investment before, and sometimes that really worked very well. One of the places that we visited on that trip was Spartanburg, South Carolina, which has the headquarters of BMW, and that has succeeded tremendously. Same with Daimler in Alabama, and same with, there's quite a few examples like that in the United States. Now, near Memphis, Ford is building this Blue Oval City, which is an immense project for electric vehicles, and this is all based on these local tax reductions. So, but again, remember, they're part of the United States, so they have a free trade zone with a huge market, and they have, good English-speaking, decently educated population, and they typically bring in the engineers from the outside that is not locally grown.
That's all I was getting at, was that I saw, so Governor Jerry Brown was governor of California a couple of years ago, and he traveled to Ireland, and he criticized a lot of the companies there because almost all the Silicon Valley companies based in California weren't technically based here. They were based in Ireland because of the tax rate. And so Ireland was getting all these taxes that, and now I'm hearing, and employment that could have gone here. And it was so much our governor flew out there to go, wow, we are losing a lot of money because you guys are acting like you're not California companies and you decided to move here. Tax money that would have gone to us, and they went there for the tax rate. I also remember the Jake Paul, Logan Paul. They're kind of YouTube youthful guys, but they're very famous and they have a big following on YouTube. And they both moved to Puerto Rico. And they took their industries and all their people, and they pulled out of America and moved to Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico got a massive amount of investment from them and jobs. And it was because there was no federal income tax. And I said, well, if you're independent, couldn't you do the same thing? I saw Ireland take away our companies. I saw Puerto Rico take away some of our YouTube stars. Couldn't an independent Southern Confederacy, or not a confederacy, but a breakaway Southern province, isn't this allowable to be discussed, that they could set separate tax policies once they're independent from America?
I mean, the question, yes, they can set separate tax policies, but will they also be able to have a free trade zone with America that they lack?
Fair.
That I think the key. Fair. Of course, quote, free trade zone with the United States in the sense that there are no tariffs on products from Puerto Rico, and Ireland had that with the EU. I also am not, and Jerry Brown with Ireland, so you need to distinguish. Ireland was primarily the location of immense profits for these companies that did not go with actual employment. I mean, these profits, quote, belong or were earned in the EU and in the United States, and were shifted artificially to Ireland using things like the big famous Google double Irish tax sandwich. And the Irish, in order to as a condition of giving the multinationals the ability to use these tax rates, force them to employ people in Ireland. But the numbers are still low. I mean, we're talking about a few thousand for each of these multinationals.
Okay.
Each of these employees, in terms of how much profit they generated, it's many, 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 tens of millions sometimes, simply because the amounts involved are so large, and they were artificially shifted to Ireland, which is why, both the EU and the United States and the OECD and the G20 and so on are trying to eliminate that part of the scheme by having this 50%.
They're jealous that they're doing too well. That's hey, didn't the Irish survive a famine? Maybe we could let them have a couple decades of good times. I mean, They survived a pretty bad famine in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken, almost killed them off. I think they have we should give them a little bit of a easy break. We're winding down, and I really appreciate you engaging in the economic questions. Thank you, Professor. I want to ask you a few more questions as just someone living in America. I understand you're not a professor on political science or sociology. I want to ask you as just a regular guy, just a regular guy who's, hey, I live here. I'm concerned about where we're going to. When Marjorie Taylor Greene talked about national divorce, people said, we don't need national divorce. We need more federalism or marriage counseling. What do those options look like in your opinion as just a regular person? What does marriage counseling look like for our divided nation? And can we even have more federalism in America? Would that even work to solve this problem?
I think we can probably have more federalism. If by federalism you mean delegating more stuff from the federal government to lower level of government.
Yes, Professor. Yes, Professor. Yes.
We do that relatively a lot, but there is probably more that can be done in terms of, adjusting various federal policies better to local conditions so that they're not kind of uniform and probably maybe unrealistic in that sense. And as far as marriage counseling is concerned, that's what I was talking about. How can you get people to talk to each other? And I wish I had a solution to that one. I wish I could get people to watch the same, even the same sports. It would be nice to start with everybody actually agreeing that they will watch the Super Bowl together. And not the others skip at each other.
We saw there was a decision by the Supreme Court on Roe v. Wade, the controversial decision on if a woman has a right to have an abortion or not. That the Supreme Court did not ban the right to have an abortion. They kicked it back to the states. And what shocked me was I saw the Republican Party, which has been the party of federalism. Let's reduce power from the federal government, give it back to the states. Like you said, let's reduce it down to the local level. And this is the Republican Party. They've been saying this for decades. This is the problem. We don't, as Ronald Reagan said, I'm from the government and I'm here to help is a fear all Republicans have. So they've always talked about reducing federalism. Roe v. Wade happens by the Supreme Court. It kicks the power back down to the states. And then the first thing the Republicans do is say, well, giving the power back to the states isn't good enough. We need a national abortion ban. If you're the only party in America that's been pushing federalism, and then the chance comes where the Supreme Court gives you federalism and you reject it and say, I don't want federalism, I want to impose my will across the whole nation, what chance do we have that we're going to pursue federalism? I mean, the main party that was all about it completely pulled a 180 and contradicted themselves. How, if the party that's pushing federalism doesn't believe in federalism, what chance do we have that we're ever going to get more federalism?
I don't know. I mean, am I optimistic? No. I'm not optimistic about our prospects of ever actually being able to heal this rift precisely for reasons like that. And because, there are other things that are related to it, which is the way that we choose our politicians, both in terms of the financing part, but also in terms of, the fact that, we gerrymander ourselves into positions that essentially every politician in the country only needs to cater to the base.
Right.
Because the vast majority of them are in really safe districts, but they cannot afford to alienate the base because then somebody will, bypass them from the left or from the right. So we've lost the center And that too, I mean, there's been movements. Michigan actually is interesting in this sense because we passed by referendum a law that's abolished, and I think it's true in other states, that abolished partisan gerrymandering in favor of a citizen commission that will draw the lines and so on. And that's been, I think, remarkably successful in pushing politics in Michigan much more towards the center where things actually are, as opposed to the extremes. I think our current governor, for example, is very much the kind of centrist that I tend to like. She's definitely not extreme one way or the other.
So there is some hope. Okay, we're winding down. Let me ask you, is there any links you would like to give? Would you like to tell people where they can read more of your material or look you up? Is there any videos you'd like people to watch or anything you want them to see or contact you?
No, look, my contact information, like most professors, is easily ascertainable online. All of my papers, everything I've ever written, is on something called ssrm.com, which is the Social Science Research Network. If you just, put in my name in there, they will have, like 100 papers on there, and you can just pick and choose if there's anything that looks interesting to you, including, this one about education and every other thing that I've ever written.
Okay. Here's the question I like to ask everybody that I'm able to do an interview with. I'd like you, Professor, if you're willing, if you could picture someone watching this interview. And we've been talking for a few minutes, and they watched it and they were interested. But 5 days from now, they can't clearly remember everything in the interview, but they're saying to themselves, I saw this interview and there was this really interesting professor and I don't clearly remember it, but he said this one thing and I can't get it out of my head. What is that sticky thought you'd like to leave America with, Professor?
I think the one thing that I keep repeating is that this has been my cause for many years now. Don't listen to anybody who tells you that we cannot afford something. We're an incredibly rich country. We can afford anything that we want. It's not a matter of not being able to afford it, regardless of what people in Washington sometimes pretend that, we are undertaxed compared to most other countries, and we are a very rich country. We can afford whatever we want. We just need to decide what we want. That's the one thing.
I haven't heard anybody say that before. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. And you're the kind of person who can make that statement, your background of tax law. So interesting. That's fascinating. We're trying to keep this conversation going. Is there anybody who's thoughtful? They're on the left, they're on the right, they're a reporter, they're an activist, they're a professor. Is anybody who might be willing to be part of this conversation we could reach out to?
Oh, there's this guy that I was thinking about while we were talking. He's one of the people that we met on the trip, who's a very thoughtful Republican. His name is Michael Render. He lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I can send you his information. He has very interesting thoughts about this topic.
Please do. I will email you in about an hour or two, Professor, with a link to this video. If you could give me his contact info, I would deeply, deeply appreciate it, sir.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That'll be it. I will email you soon, Professor, and I appreciate it.
Sure.